You've already gone, perfect. You've already gone through your regular meeting and everything. So
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet, Vicki. We're still waiting for some people to come in.
Perfect.
It's, I guess, not quite 7:30 yet, I don't think. So,
Oh yeah, no, we're definitely before 10. So at 7:30, I can officially start, and I'll give a little background about
yeah, and
everything.
our meetings are, they're pretty informal, especially since we've been in Zoom. So
Yeah.
any business type things we'll deal with after.
Okay, that's
you
great.
fix your things. So. Yeah, so just if you don't mind just waiting a few minutes just to make sure we've got as many people as possible.
I just let 2 more people in, so.
Yeah,
How
yeah.
big is your beekeeping group?
For our Zoom meetings, Vicki, we have anywhere in 25 to 30 range. When we were meeting more formally, there was more people. I think our paid membership when we were joining us tonight. But Vicki's been working in pollinator conservation for over a decade. She started it after taking an apiculture course at Guelph during her undergrad, so she probably knows some of the people we've had as speakers before, Paul. So honeybees turned around to wild bees, and wild bees turned around to city bees. Vicki completed a Ph.D. in urban ecology at the University of California, Berkeley, focusing on urban habitat are used by pollinators. And her professional work post-grad focused on the agroecosystems and other modified landscapes. Bees are everywhere, so if there's a landscape with bees, she's interested in finding out more. And so I'll turn it over to you now, Vicki.
Thanks, Gord. That's great. That's a recent update I did to my bio because we're doing so many of these Zoom meetings these days. I had something incredibly wordy and lengthy, so I shortened it and really picked up the highlights. But that's my backstory. I started out at Guelph, just a general bio major, and got really into bees, and let that just take me where I am now. So I work now for Pollinator Partnership in Canada, and it's a conservation organization focused on all pollinators. And what makes us a little unique in the conservation and sustainability world is that we actually do work with honeybees, with beekeepers, and in that sphere. So the presentation I'm going to give you today, it might have a little bit of a title that makes you think that we're opposed to honeybees, and that's certainly not the case. But because we work in this spectrum where managed honeybees interact with wild bees in various landscapes, sometimes in agriculture, sometimes in wildlands, sometimes it's conservation, sometimes it's bee health. We're keen on having the best results for all bees because we recognize obviously how important honeybees are to agriculture, but also the conservation of wild bees. And again, that makes us unique because a lot of conservation groups focus on everything but honeybees. And certainly we don't do honeybee conservation because that's not the right use of the term. But we're very interested in all things bee and have some great collaborations with beekeepers. So I'm going to share my screen now, pardon me, or just my presentation. And what I wanted to talk to you today actually was the kind of summary of research that we've done, myself in particular working with my colleagues on this concept of bee competition. So yes, colony collapse disorder got all sorts of people looking at bees and super interested into honeybees. And from the perception of the general public, there was a little bit of a skewed message at some point where a lot of people started focusing on how you can exclusively improve the health of honeybees. And, everyone was getting into beekeeping, especially urban beekeeping. Beekeepers were looking for places to pasture their bees. And the public was definitely focused on, hey, we need to help out the honeybees. And there is a question of how managed honeybees interact with wild bees. I actually think it's really interesting from the science, and that's what I'll be presenting today, the background and the science on it. So there's absolutely a potential for competition between a honeybee and a wild bee or a native bee. In the context of North America, I'm using the term native bee, but the research I'll be reviewing actually has been done globally. And in Europe and Africa, honeybees they're native. So the concept there is not honeybee versus native bee, it's honeybee and wild bee because the honeybee is managed. Nevertheless, they both require pollen and nectar from flowers. And so there is this potential for competition, that they're going to fight for a limited resource. Fight's not necessarily the right word there, but that they're going to compete for a resource that's limited. And there's a lot of challenges that beekeepers are facing, and honeybees are really, really important. So I just pulled these numbers today. The presentation I shared with Gord when I was seeing if this was a fit for you all was actually based on some US data. So if you saw the numbers before, these are our Canadian numbers, the most current StatsCan and Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada numbers on honeybees. So we've got just shy of 800,000 colonies of honeybees in Canada that have been valued at providing $2.57 billion directly to our agricultural economy. So that's not insignificant. That is a huge number. The honey production value that's coming out of bees, again, most recent data we have coming from 2019, $173 million worth of honey production, or just over 80 million pounds of honey being produced. So again, not in any way insignificant. And I should say that these are all commercial statistics. So it doesn't include smaller beekeepers that are not registering their colonies. It doesn't include farmers market type scenarios, hobbyists at all. And then honeybees and other bees pollinate 80% of the crops that we benefit from. So they're very, very important. But the other part of the bee community in Canada, and this might be very, very interesting new information, or just a great reiteration if you've gotten into your wild native bees, is the wild native bees. There are over 800 species of bees in Canada. They are very diverse. So if I'm being a little jargony here, I'll try to put some stuff into more basic terms, but they have these spatiotemporal patterns of occurrence. Well, what does that mean? That they occur at different times in different places. So not only are there a lot of them, but when they are around in the landscape is specific. There's spring bees and summer bees, and there's bees that primarily forage earlier in the day or later in the day. They have unique feeding preferences, so they don't always go to the same plants. Sometimes they're very specific. Sometimes, like bumblebees, they're a little more general, kind of like honeybees. There's so many of them. It's often news to people that there's so many bees, and it's also news to a lot of conservation biologists that there are so many bees. So we don't know their status. It's not a discipline that has decades of history where I can tell you where all 800 species are, how they're doing. Climate change has a really big impact on pollinators. Honeybees absolutely can show some of these signs. The wild bees have the same issues where they can struggle when their floral resources start to bloom, out of season, etc. And we do know in Canada that we have a few listed species. So there are some wild species of bees that we are concerned about their status. The rusty patch bumblebee, you may have heard of it being in Ontario. This is a species that is the last visual record of the species was in 2009. So it is considered to be very likely extinct in Ontario. It still does have some range in the United States. There's also the cuckoo bumblebee and another bee just called the cuckoo bee, a different type of bee that are documented to be in very, very severe decline. Okay. And native bees, wild bees, these solitary bees or bumblebees, that group of non-honeybee bees, some of them are absolutely used for management and pollination. So we have a handful of bumblebee species that are commercially managed. You can order up and order a bumblebee colony. You can also order up some leafcutter bees. And Not as much here in Ontario, but if you go out west more into the prairies, the last little name I have there, Nomia melanderi, that's an alkali bee. So it pollinates alfalfa, similar to an alfalfa leaf cutting bee, but it actually just really likes very salty soils where it gets its name from, the alkali bee. So there are absolutely some bees that are managed that are not honeybees. So it's not the only managed species out there. And I've been told by beekeepers and the research that we've done and the organizations we work with. And so if this is not true for you, that's I'd love to hear, but I generally of the opinion that beekeepers really like pasturing bees on natural landscapes. There's a lot of benefits for this. They have abundant, diverse flora, food resources. There's usually little to no chemical inputs. So depending on the scale of your beekeeping, if you're more hobbyist, you might not be subjected to some of these, but if you're a larger scale beekeeper that's doing pollination contracts in agriculture, you very often are running up against the issue of your bees being in a landscape where they may interact with a pesticide. So it's double-edged sword. You really want the bees there to pollinate. That's your income source, but there's a risk to them. There's often few alternatives to where you would put your bees if you're trying to feed them versus sugar syrup or synthetic bee diet. And on a lot of other like pasture lands, like let's say high honey production lands, there's often a concept of overcrowding. So again, not something that I've heard a lot from Ontario, but if we go out west, or if we talk to some beekeepers that are in the American Midwest, they often do a lot of honey production either on fallow fields that are planted in clover or canola or just other wildflower fields. And there's a lot of bees in the same space. So you're running into issues sometimes where there's competition for you and another beekeeper just next door. The situation has become in some places where in the past, you could put your bees down and not see another bee yard. And now you're putting your bees down somewhere, and to the left and right of you, there are other bee yards. So again, food resources are in demand, definitely, when they're in a good area. But these natural landscapes are also the ecosystems for native wild bees. There's that coevolution between the native plants and the pollinators. And many times we're looking at remnants or reserves of habitat for species that are at risk. So it's a challenge in natural landscapes or anytime there's a floral landscape. So just if we're thinking about a little bit of bees on natural landscapes, what do I mean by this? And it kind of falls into these questions on forest lands, parklands, other public lands. There's often land trusts that have conservation in mind, but they also do like to provide some agricultural services, utility corridors, industrial lands. So pretty much anywhere there's a large landscape, there's an opportunity to have great habitat for feeding your bees. So something we're concerned with as a conservation organization is that we want to find a point where we can balance both improving honeybee health, which is vital to agriculture, but not causing any detrimental effects to vulnerable bee populations, preserving biodiversity. But we really want to base action on evidence, right? So this is where the science part of the talk comes in. And we've often been asked as a conservation group to advise or to, depending who's asking us, to prohibit honeybees from interacting with wild bees on a certain natural landscape, or to absolutely advocate for allowing the placement of honeybees on a natural landscape. And what we'd like to be able to do, which I'm kind of spoiling it for you by telling you this now, we don't really have great guidance because the science is very lean. We would like to say, well, the science says you can have this many hives at this density and there shouldn't be any concerns. So this is a great situation. And that's a little bit out of reach right now. It's really hard to find evidence that's convincing one way or another if there's a cause for concern or no cause for concern when it comes to this interaction of honeybees and wild bees. One of the main reasons is it's really hard to conduct a study where you can't poke holes at it and say, well, I'm not sure if your conclusion's really valid, because did you think about these variables? The other problem is, I just told you that there are 800 different species of bees in Canada. So having a singular response from 800 different types of species is also very unlikely. So probably there's going to be a scenario where some bees are impacted and some aren't. And then something we run up against when we're looking at the science that we found is not correct, is that a lot of studies, so if you've heard perhaps in the news, or you've heard someone say definitively, honeybees negatively impact wild bees because they exclude them from floral resources. A lot of times they're talking about studies that have just looked at the patterns of bees visiting flowers. So they will maybe put a honeybee hive next to some flowers and look to see how many bees are on those flowers with the hive. They'll take the hive away and then look how many bees are there with the honeybees gone. And then they'll make a conclusion that with or without honeybees, this is what I saw. But we actually know from doing further studies on how over time populations go, that foraging patterns don't correlate with understanding if there's competition. So if there's any survival issues or growth issues, the key variables we want to measure. So it's a very long-winded way of me saying there's a lot of studies out there that are telling you there is competition or there's not, based on looking at flowers and bees, and that's not where you need to look. So that's not helpful. So there's two types of competition that we might look at when we're talking about bees and competition. One is interference competition, which is this concept of directly with physical contact, preventing access to the resource. It does happen in bees, but it's really, really rare. So what we're actually really looking at is evidence of exploitative competition, where the floral resource is being depleted by one bee before the other bee gets there. And there's a winner and a loser in that kind of context. And then the question that comes up to us again as a conservation organization is there a competitive advantage that honeybees might have? And it's a really valid point. And in truth, there absolutely is. So on the one hand, you have a managed agricultural species that is protected against disease as much as we can. Obviously, I know honeybee health is certainly compromised, inclement weather and all that by humans. The species can be moved to an area with really great food if you don't have food in one area. Whereas, so there's the human part, right? And then there's the other part of could a honeybee have an advantage just by being a honeybee? And maybe it makes a lot of sense. You have a large colony. Unlike other bees, honeybees can communicate and recruit other foragers to resources. So a solitary wild bee is out there just looking for food with no one telling it where they also found really great food. Honeybees are also really great generalist feeders. So they're not picky. I mean, they are. I know they have preferences, but in a landscape with a bunch of floral resources, generally speaking, they'll find something, whereas wild bees might not, because they usually forage on a narrower range. And honeybees also, their lifestyle is that their colony overlaps the years and seasons, and they're adapted with their social lifestyle to when times are bad, they can deal with it. That's why they make honey. So, okay, in the wild bee community, all these solitary bees or semi-social bees like bumblebees, where might we actually see competition? Can we predict this? We're not going to go test, the all 800 species. We don't have time. No one wants to fund that kind of research. So there's these two leading hypotheses. And again, there's a lot of jargon thrown in here, but it's always interesting if you haven't seen the terms before to learn a bit about solitary bee diet preferences. So one hypothesis says, if there's competition, it's going to be between the specialized species, which are called either oligolectic or mesolectic, meaning oligolectic is a feeding range where they feed on plants in multiple genera. And mesolectic is a little smaller, so like only one or two genera. So multiple species of plants, but they have similarities. So these species with a narrow niche that they only feed on certain plants those are the ones that are going to be the most at risk for competition, because if someone else is feeding on their food, there's really nowhere for them to go. But then there's another theory that's like, well, actually, no, it's the polylectic feeders like bumblebees, where they feed on the same broad range of species that honeybees do. And the reason there is that, well, they'll find competition in all of their food range. So actually, they're going to suffer the most because they have almost full overlap with what a honeybee would be looking at. So there are two possibilities. Anyway, so we did a literature search, and we wanted to see who published research on bee competition. And we did scientific database research. We did just Google research because there's a lot of interesting, good work that's not always in the published work. We looked at other reviews. We solicited from our peers if they're working on a study that we need to know about that's not published yet. In the end, we ended up with what doesn't seem like a lot. I mean, there are millions of publications out there. We only found 78 papers that were trying to find out if there's competition between bees, which again seems super low given how interesting and important the concept is. And of those papers, 13 were previous reviews where someone had already said, I'm going to see what the general consensus is on conservation. And then we looked at them to see if they were actually experimental studies or if they were these papers where someone said, I saw a change in foraging patterns on the plants, so competition is either yes or no based on this observation. And that narrowed it down to just 19 studies. So coming from this, we really have very little information.
For the bee club.
Oh, nice.
So,
The bee association.
right. So basically what we ended up having in these 19 studies was almost a split down the middle of 10 studies indicating that there really wasn't any competition that could be seen.
I just went,
9 studies showing that there actually
was
was.
bending right over and I saw your eye
I'm
hole.
just wondering if we could ask the participants to mute maybe just because microphones can pick up lots of chatter. Thanks. Not a big deal. Onward we go. So yeah, so almost a 50-50 split. Yes, there's competition. No, there isn't. And then when we looked at the papers that said, yeah, there is competition, we wanted to see what they were actually measuring. And then only 5 of those papers looked at fitness or reproduction. So if we're trying to think about, is there actually competition? We have to think if some species is, it sounds very dramatic, but is a species suffering to survive? Does it make it? One makes it and one doesn't. And so often the way that this is measured to see if there is any impact is a species reproduction reduced? So for a bee, are the bees laying less eggs? Are less larvae pupating to adults? Are less adults being produced? Are adults physically smaller in size? Are reproductives like queens being produced? So only 5 research papers of this 78 that we found looked at reproductive outputs to see if competition was in fact measurable there and impacted. So I was going to go over some of the findings of these various studies for you. I think it's interesting just to see how these experiments work. So you can see from the perspective of a researcher what they were doing to their honeybees, what were they doing to the wild bees. And it's a great discussion point. And obviously you have the references with you because I've attached the research paper to the email that I sent to Gord. So you can always go back and read them yourself. In any case, is there anything that we can say about, like, is there any conclusion that we can give before we get into the details? So I just told you that one hypothesis, or the 2 hypotheses, pardon me. Who's going to suffer the most if there is competition? Is it the specialized bees or the generalized bees? And it's, again, almost 50-50. So of these 19 studies, 4 of them actually focused on the specialized bees. And they did find some negative impacts in the 4 there. The ones that focused on bumblebees also found a few negative, it was inconsistent, so not all of them, but found some negative impacts. So it seems like both are possible, which is, it makes perfect sense with how diverse bees are. So both types of feeders, generalist feeders and specialist feeders, can have interference in their landscape from competition, from something extra in the landscape. So I wanted to look at some of the studies and just give you a brief outline. So this will be a little dense. And I am presenting other people's research here, so I can always do, if you have a question, I'm going to do my best, but I'm not the primary author always, so I might not be able to answer all the details. So one study that looked to find, see if there was competition and actually didn't find any, was this really good study by Thomson that was carried out in California. And what they basically found, and this one actually helped structure a lot of our thinking, was that they tried to look at throughout the months, throughout multiple years, if there was competition between honeybees and bumblebees in the same environment, based on what was naturally in bloom. And they didn't really find a consistent trend. They found some months where it looked like honeybees were doing better. They found some months where it looked like bumblebees were doing better. But what they did find was that if you just looked at the foraging patterns, like I mentioned before, and didn't look at reproduction, you were getting the wrong story. So what they actually found in their study was that in some cases, they found bumblebee numbers increasing on flowers. And when they followed up to see if there was any indication on the reproduction side of things, they found actually reduced reproduction in cases where foragers were more abundant. And reading the whole paper, what they actually came to the conclusion of, because they did a demographic study on the worker proportions in the bumblebee colony, was that when bumblebees were encountering more honeybees in their landscape, they were actually recruiting more foragers and producing less queens for reproduction. They were spending their colony energy making more foragers, so there were more foragers in the landscape so that they could get more food. So it was this interesting strategy. So what I love about this is it's great proof that you'll miss the point if all you do is look at flowers. It's just not helpful. It could be masking something else. Another study that we reviewed again that didn't show any competition was looking at if you had, again, this was based just on visitation. They didn't examine reproductive output, but they had a landscape where they would add various numbers of honeybee hives and would look at a shared resource and see if there was more native bees or less native bees on the flowers with or without honeybees. And the pictures might be small, so you'll have to take my word for it, but pretty much there was very similar inconclusive patterns when you looked at all the bees in general. There was no trend. So with or without honeybees, there was the same amount of native bees. When you looked at the different types of native bees, this is where it got a little bit more interesting. They did find that some species were in fact depressed when honeybees were in the area. And here the numbers are actually for bumblebees. There was less bumblebees where honeybees were present. It's just really hard to tell from this graph. And other bees didn't seem to mind. So in this particular case, there was not really competition at the community level. If you looked at bumblebees, maybe. So again, not wildly helpful. The next study that we looked at, and I'm not going to show you all 19 because that would be a little too intense, too dense for an evening. So then the next one that we looked at was just, again, it was looking at floral visitation patterns, and it looked at bumblebee forager abundance on floral resources, various floral resources. So 6 or 7 different types of flowers. Is there a difference in the number of bumblebees that are on those flowers with or without honeybees? And again, this one didn't find that there was any differential, even on resources that were specifically shared. So they went to the landscape and looked at first, what are bumblebees foraging on? What are honeybees foraging on? Where's the overlap? Now let's look at the overlap and only look at that and see if there's any exclusion. Do honeybees make bumblebees move to different flowers and whatnot? And again, they didn't find that there was competition from the measures. So now getting into some of the studies that actually did find competition. This is another study by Thomson, the same author that gave us that really good study that looking at flowers doesn't really help you very much. What they did this time was, it was the follow-up to that study where they looked at reproduction. How many queens or gines were being produced by bumblebee colonies in landscapes with and without honeybees. And again, the graphs are a little bit hard to read. I like to have a visual, so I just pulled the graph out. But the text there basically explains what the authors found, that when bumblebee colonies were physically near to honeybees, and they actually tested distance as well. So that was a really interesting factor. Is it a shared landscape issue? Or is it, oh, they're a little too close, so if we put our honeybees, further away, that's not an issue. They did find that in proximal situations, but proximal was actually within 500 to 600 meters. So about a half kilometer was enough for them to see a measurable impact. In proximal conditions, the bumblebees made less gines, so less queens, and they also made less males, so their colony reproduction was reduced. The next study that found competition was actually a really interesting one, where they weren't looking at reproductive output, they were measuring bumblebee size, which correlates with how much food is brought back to the hive. So it's a bit of an indirect measure, but it's a really good, strong correlate. And it was based all on wild landscapes. So the previous study actually had commercial bumblebees in a box that were purchased and honeybees in a hive. So both were managed species, so to speak. This study looked at a landscape. This was done in England, a natural landscape with a bunch of different bumblebee species, in which the landscape was very close to agriculture, and it was not uncommon for honeybees to be pastured adjacent to fields or within this landscape. So in landscapes that they said, there's honeybees here, we can see the hives, we know they're here, how big are the bumblebees in size? In landscapes where we actually know there aren't hives, maybe there's honeybees on the flowers, but there's no density of hives, how big are the bumblebees? And they did notice in 4 of the species, I think there were 8 or 9 that they looked at, a significant decrease in size. So the conclusion there was that actually the bumblebees were smaller compared to bumblebees in non-honeybee landscapes. So there very well may be a food competition issue, and they're getting a little less food, so they're smaller in the end. Another study that did find a competitive response was one where they looked at the colony weight, so the physical reproduction and through weight. So they were weighing colonies of bumblebees for how heavy they were as an indicator of both bumblebee honey production and physical bumblebee production. So larvae having a weight and the honey having a weight. And they did find that bumblebee colonies that were physically closer to an apiary, so they did like a distance experiment here, they weighed less. The colonies did weigh less, and they were producing fewer and smaller queens when they went and looked at that. So again, here's a study that did show that at least in a distance effect, there's some impact to being near a honeybee hive. Just a few more, and then we can chat a bit about what this means, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Now, here's a study that was done in an Australian agricultural setting, and it looked at not bumblebees, but a solitary bee in the genus Hylaeus. So it's a small little tube nesting bee. And what was really interesting about this one is that it's not a bumblebee. Bumblebees are actually really easy to study. All of these other solitary bees, if you want to study their reproduction, gosh, like dig in the soil to find their nests or put out some trap nests. It's a little difficult, which is why there's not a lot of information. But in this particular study, they put out tube nests that the Hylaeus species lives in into an agricultural field. And again, they had their comparison where they had some fields with honeybees present and some fields without. And they looked over time, over the seasons, to see if there was competition, defined by how many larvae or how many eggs were laid in the hive, so not hive, in the tube nest. And they did find that not all the time, but there were a few parts of the year where actually there was reduced reproduction when there was honeybees present. Another study that looked at solitary bees that nest in tubes. Oh, pardon me, I have a little monster in the background, but they'll keep busy with something else. Looking at tube nesting bees, mason bees in the genus Osmia. So they did the same kind of study where they had tube nests set up. And this was actually a cage experiment, which is really, really interesting. So they had a cage, really big cage, a bunch of tube nests with Osmia in them. And some cages also had an apiary in them and some cages didn't. And when I say the term cage, we're not talking small. They actually netted areas around some apple orchards. So they had these very large kind of controlled experiments where they forced both the Osmia mason bees and the honeybees to only feed on restricted resources in that area. And they measured the reproductive output of those mason bees. And they did find that in this case, which you could be critical because it's not a natural situation where any bee could go anywhere. So in a very forced environment where you are limiting the resources, is there competition? And they did actually find, as you increase the number of honeybees, a drastic increase in the reproductive output of those mason bees. But again, it's I struggle with this one a little bit because having 300 honeybee foragers in a caged area with limiting resources is it's not really a natural experiment, but it's a really cool experiment of what would happen if we got into this type of scenario. So what can we say that's supported by the science when we get asked these questions, and what kind of recommendations do we have when someone says, should I put honeybees here? Should I not allow someone to have honeybees here? You know, municipalities are starting to ask these questions. We've even had conversations coming much more so from some of our colleagues in the United States, where there's much more of a long history of honeybees using Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service land for forage. What can we say? Well, it turns out that both hypotheses can be correct at times. So, you know, bees are really diverse. So we can't definitively say that there's only one small portion of the wild bee community that might be impacted. So we can assume that it's potentially there's so much diversity, I can't predict if this species or this species is going to be impacted by a competitive interaction. It's really hard to make a universal statement. The results from the science, as limited as it is, were 50-50. So when the assessment was looking at reproductive output, the results were a little bit more convincing that there is some kind of reproductive output consequence. So with this kind of like really gray area, what we would recommend, given the information, is if you really wanted to pasture honeybees, and it's very different than, you know, beekeeping in an urban area or beekeeping in a smaller context. But if we want to pasture large apiaries, we would want to be sensitive to landscapes that we know have bumblebee species at risk, especially during colony reproduction. And that seems like a really actionable and mindful piece of recommendation, you know. And the other recommendation we had, which is kind of silly, like most scientists always say, well, more research to fill the gaps. But it is true. We actually do need more research to be able to give good advice. And so some of the gaps where, you know, we get asked these questions and we struggle because we don't have an answer is, are floral resources ever actually limited? That is a really good question. So on the native bee side of things, there are a lot of researchers that would also rebut this question of, is there competition between honeybees and wild bees, native bees? And they'd say, well, is there competition between native bees and native bees? And there absolutely is. And there are some species of native bees that are considered to be aggressive species. So even though they're native, they exclude other species when they're very dominant in the landscape. A really good thing that would be useful, if it's possible, is this concept of calculating a carrying capacity. So how many bees can I put here? Both wild bees and honeybees. There's some really great researchers at the University of Utah, Jim Kane, some of you may have heard of him, and Vincent Pedino. They did an assessment where they wanted to liken honeybees to the way cattle grazing is managed, where it's like how many heads of cattle per acre you can have and still have a good regenerative system with the grasses. So they figured out that for at least one wild bee species, Megachile rotundata, which is a leafcutter bee, one honeybee hive feeding in 1 month takes about as much food as 33,000 leafcutter bees. That's kind of logical because a honeybee hive has about that many bees. So one piece of information, one step forward that we can maybe estimate what kind of impact a honeybee hive might have. It would be great if more species were studied. Back to that, we need more data question. So less than 20 species of bees have been studied for their interactions with honeybees. And there's 800 species in Canada, 20,000 species in the world. So that's essentially zero when we're talking about those numbers. And another really big issue in all of the studies is that none of the studies looked at changes over time. So even studies that said, actually, there is competition. Look how many less queens are being produced. Look how much smaller these workers are. None of those studies looked over time to see if that trend led to the population getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is something that I have a bit of a problem with, because if you know insect biology, as beekeepers do, there's something about insects where they make a lot of insects because everything eats insects and their landscape's unpredictable. So in ecology, the concept is it's called an R-selected strategy. So there's these, again, two leading hypotheses of how species reproduce to make sure that future generations survive. And species that are usually large-bodied species, so a lot of mammals, tend to reproduce very slowly and with very few offspring because they live in stable environments and they're usually higher on a trophic level, top of the food chain, if that's how you see it. Insects and other species are the total opposite. They're our strategists, which means they produce a lot of offspring often because most of those offspring don't make it in a natural circumstance. So it's a great question. If you're making fewer queens or fewer laying fewer eggs as a solitary bee, what's the threshold? Where's the issue? You know, all great questions. So I've left you with probably more questions than answers. I like I said, I did send Gord the copy of this research paper that summarized all of this, and hopefully he shared it with you if you're interested in reading it and following up on some of the other questions that we had. And also, I'd love to chat more about the specifics, but again, I don't want to inundate you with numbers and stats and figures. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this, or even take the discussion somewhere else. So thanks for having me for a little bit here.
Well, first off, thanks very much, Vicki. I certainly found it interesting. If anybody has any questions, as Vicki said, please speak up. I know generally we're not shy, so.
Vicki, I've got a question. You said that one of the recommendations you might make is not to pasture honeybees in a space where that is home to bumblebees. So how do we know that?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you asked that question, because that's there's bumblebees everywhere, right? So what we were getting at with that is, so if you are a land manager that's managing a large landscape, and this is more of a conversation we're having with like a national park manager or a biological reserve manager that does actually permit honeybees to forage on the landscapes. And again, there's actually, there's even some really interesting examples of historic sites where part of the historic site is the historic agriculture, again, which very often included honeybees. Okay, so in those circumstances, if that landscape also overlaps with the known range, which we do know, of bumblebee species at risk. So not all bumblebee species, because to be clear, there's a very large diversity of bumblebee species. Some of them are doing awesome. They're aggressive. They can outcompete other bumblebees. But for the ones that we know that are at risk, we know a lot about them. I said we don't know enough about bees in general, but when a species gets listed, we do know its population status, we know its range, we know that there's been a decline in range, so we know what's current habitat, what's historic habitat, all of that. So in those circumstances, if you have an overlap with historic habitat of a bumblebee species at risk, it's best to be cautious and say, you know what, not this time of year, not here right now. So, and I think that's a great recommendation. And that doesn't impact a lot of landscape, truthfully. So yeah, thanks for asking that. That's a great question.
Vicki, do you take into consideration when you're comparing these bees that are vastly different in architecture, size, that sort of thing, how far they fly from home, the distances they travel? Wouldn't that impact the study as well that you're doing?
Yeah, no, it really would. And that's why there's a lot of these complicating factors. So some studies were just absolutely place-based. So in this spot, do I see competition? And again, remember, there were only 19 that actually had a reasonable result that we could work with, and 10 of those that showed competition, 9 that didn't. Less than, I think, 2, if I'm remembering correctly, looked at what you mentioned, this distance-based effect with consideration of the body size and dispersibility of other wild bees, which while it can vary, there's that kind of common knowledge that if it's a very small bee, it's considered to only disperse about 200 meters maximum from its nest, and then a mid-sized bee maybe half kilometer, and then a bumblebee or large size bee, really in Canada mostly bumblebees, up to about 2 kilometers. So presumably there's areas where just in terms of flight radius you would have potential competition or not. And the other factor there that kind of your question makes me think of too is, so if you're one of these bees, you tend to forage where your nest is. So yeah, if you were to, there's a lot of ifs here, but if you were to site an apiary that is not near, like not smack in the middle of a very dense floral resource, which is the likely spot for there to be the nest of the wild bee, because they tend to nest in their food, that's their light habit, you could probably make some good management choices as well. But then my mind starts to go to the fact that honeybees are really smart at using their energy, and they do tend to forage closer to the hive. So you do, there's just so many moving parts and so many factors, but yeah, it's a good question, and it's only been considered in a handful of studies because it's just really difficult to do the experiment so that someone won't like say, I don't believe what you found because did you think about this, right?
Now it's interesting. Whenever I always like to stop and looking at the bees on the flowers and stuff like that. So I have 5 hives, so technically you could have 150, 200,000 bees there, right? I'm just on 2 acres. So, and it's interesting observation because when I look at some of the trees that are out in flower, the plants or whatever, there's a high percentage of a time, I believe they're called sweat bees
Mhm.
that I see, and as opposed to my honeybees. So I keep thinking, okay, so the honeybees are way bigger, and as someone else said, yeah, so are they traveling a lot farther to get the honey, and the local guys just hanging around locally, right? And then the other observation is this year, at least from my side, there's a lot more bumblebees floating around. And they tend to be, you see them more in the early morning and late at night kind of thing, because I think they survive the cold a little bit better than the honeybees. So I think they're foraging sometimes at different time, eh? But also, I think near my beehives, I have a bumblebee hive because every time I go down to the beehives, there's bumblebees floating around there too. So just some interesting observations.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you share that, because it also just noting the sweat bees and the bumblebees and where you're seeing them and where you're not seeing them really kind of focuses on this question, this not question, but this concept that, you know, landscapes tend to be really diverse floristically. There's trees, there's plants, they bloom at different times of year. And if you want to throw an even more complicated factor into it, when you get to the individual daily activity of the flower, both pollen and nectar is regenerated throughout, like in a lot of species, one day, and then it's taken by bees, and then it's regenerated the next day. So there are a lot of bee biologists, like I said, that when you ask this question, is pollen and nectar ever limited? Because for competition to happen, theoretically, I mean, you have to have a limited resource. So there's a scarcity of something and everyone's going after the same thing. And in natural landscapes, we're usually not seeing a scarcity of pollen and nectar, because that would be a just the exact opposite of an evolutionary strategy from the perspective of a plant having just a little bit of pollen. Maybe someone takes it, maybe someone doesn't. Plants want to produce a lot of pollen, both to attract a lot of bees to the plant and then get a lot of that pollen on that bee and have it move from plant to plant. So it's unlikely that pollen limitation is a factor, but that kind of spatial segregation and getting to the flower first and taking all of the pollen before another bee gets there could very well be a factor, even in an abundant landscape. If, like, you know, like a bumblebee is great, it wakes up early, can deal with the cold, gets the pollen first. Whoever gets there next, oh, I have to wait for tomorrow. So, but yeah, thank you for your observation.
Yeah.
I would just like to make a few comments. Last year we grew sunflowers, and at one time there would be 6 or 7 varieties of bees on it. They all didn't seem to bother each other. So here, are you hearing me?
Yes, yep.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Anyway, so anyway, that's just a comment. They seem to get along very nicely. Now, I think our biggest problem in agricultural areas is the loss of natural habitat and not knowing what crop is going to be grown next, because there used to be a lot of canola and bees loved canola. There's hardly any grown here now because the climate has warmed. It will not grow here. Well, it's just too hot. So you've got a complete change of diet. Some people down in Alliston who had bees for a very long time, and they were saying their biggest problem is the loss of agricultural blooms, because hay now is being cut before it starts to bloom. Dairy farmers want high protein. Early hay, like early flowers with barely a flower in it, is high protein. The more flower, the less protein, higher carbohydrate. Dairy farmers don't want that. So you've got fewer and fewer options for beekeepers to place their hives. You've really, really got to look around. We have a farm. Brian grows everything specifically for the bees. But most people who just have an acre or two, like Tom, you don't have that option. So there are fewer flowers for bees of any kind.
Yes.
And I don't mean just honeybees, I mean any kind. Trees are being cut down. The trees that are being put back, that are being grown, a lot of them aren't native. Can the bees get into them? That there's all of the floral resources, whether they be trees or plants, have changed so drastically in the last 20 years. And with the chemicals that are being used, that's changed the landscape so much too. And that wasn't discussed in any of the studies that we saw. A lot of them are very early. The study about Australia, that was done before the mites got to Australia. And that made a big difference too. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say.
No, and I thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment. And often when I give this the presentation on the findings of bee competition, and I'm speaking to more of a large commercial beekeeper audience, I do a lot more background on exactly what you mentioned, that, you know, why is this an issue? Why did it come up? Well, because you used to be able to satisfy your forage needs within an agricultural landscape. And with the scarcity of flowers, for any number of reasons, the ones you described, very often you have beekeepers looking for somewhere with flowers, because where they used to get their flowers, they don't have them anymore. And that's where the question of, well, maybe you shouldn't put bees here started to get as a pushback, because some of these great landscapes were not necessarily always conservation lands, but lands that were highly naturalized. So great, appealing, lots of flowers, but, you know, rightfully so, people started thinking, is this an issue? So again, still largely unanswered, but certainly a question, because our agricultural lands are less diverse and have less food now than they did even in the recent past. So thank you for your comments.
Do you think there's been more of a push for advocating for natural bee population in the city, in urban versus rural?
Yeah, and I think, yes, I think that's been an issue. And one of the reasons is that, well, there's a lot of reasons. And like my personal research specialty prior to getting really into the ag was urban ecology. And so you have a really modified landscape with so many resources. And to make the story as short as possible, urban areas, for the most part, are incredibly high diversity with so many things, a lot of non-natives, a lot of natives. And that's driven a lot of bee diversity as well. And so it's a very complicated landscape. And when researchers started looking, they started to find that, yeah, there actually is a huge diversity of native bees in urban areas. There's also a lot of urban beekeepers that loves the beekeeping. They love urban honey. They love the kind of sustainable education you can have with honeybee husbandry. And then the question comes up, it's like, well, all these wild bees are in the city because out there is terrible for them, which is not 100% true. Ag environments can actually be pretty great. There's a lot of natural areas, but that's what's actually kind of got this thinking going, that the realization that in the highly modified urban landscapes we've actually created a habitat that's been very well used by native bees. So what's going to happen now if we're urban beekeeping? And I don't have an answer one way or another. I think in an urban context, because the floral resources are a little bit more scattered, you might get into an issue where there could be a resource limitation. It's not a natural landscape, it's highly modified, but I don't have enough background data to really guide me to an answer. But thanks for your question as well. Yeah, a lot of the question does come from urban areas and from often very well-meaning citizen scientists that will say, I saw so many more bees on my garden before my neighbor got a beehive, which maybe, but it's already been very well established that what we see on the flower is no indication of what's actually happening in the whole system. So we can't use that. Anyway, thanks again for the question.
I have a question here. We have a cottage up north. You're talking about the bumblebees. We've seen a few of them around up there. We don't want to put beehives up there because of the bears. We don't want to get into all that fences and so on. What can we do to encourage the bumblebees? Is there any special plant or anything to draw them in to help flourish the area?
Right. So bumblebees are very generalist feeders, not unlike honeybees. And if you want to encourage their population, certainly just making sure there's a lot of plants in bloom. I'm definitely going to suggest native plants to the area, but bumblebees being generalist, if you have a herb garden, they'll certainly use that as well. A key factor with bumblebees getting good forage is them getting good forage in the spring when they're building their colony, and then in the fall when they're producing queens. So I could actually, I'll send Gord a link to some of the eco-regional planting guides we have. It gives you a list of species that are good for pollinators for bees in your ecological region. So you can pick the one that works for where your cottage is. And in addition to giving you a list of species, it tells you what time of year they bloom at, so that you can make some choices about planting. And that's an active planting thing. So yeah, if you want to actively do something on your cottage property to help those bumblebee populations, just providing them more food in the spring and in the late summer is a great way to do that. Thank you for the question.
Is there anything we can do as hobbyist beekeepers to assist you in what you're doing?
I mean, there's a lot you could. I think one of the best things is having the opportunity to speak to you and just have the conversation, because I think beekeepers can be one of the biggest allies of native pollinators and their conservation when they know about native bees, they're mindful, they want to have the whole ecosystem function better. So I think it's great to learn more about these interactions and the synergies the species can have, and just like spread the word to others so that they know, because yeah, that's one of the best things, that you could do. So again, I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you. And yeah, I couldn't have asked for more. Just open-mindedness and interest in the topic is really, really, really up there. Thanks.
Well, I want to perhaps just, if there's no more questions, just thank Vicki. It's been an enjoyable hour. Certainly appreciate your time, and your enthusiasm is contagious. So thanks very much, Vicki.
Thanks, Gord. I appreciate it as well. I really enjoyed chatting with you. So I'll send you a follow-up email with some of those resources. And yeah, again, thanks again. I'm going to log off. You may have heard in the background, there's a lot of like small child chaos in my house. It's definitely bedtime. So I'll go see how they're doing. But again, thanks again. And thank you for your interest. And hopefully we can keep in touch and keep the conversation going.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.